All right, just give it a second to let people log into the live stream, and then we'll get down to work. All right, I think that's a reasonable time for people to log in. So just start off with a little bit of housekeeping. As I hope you all know, because you've been keeping up with the counting of the Omer, we are coming up Motzei Shabbat this coming Saturday night, and then Sunday and Monday through the holiday of Shavuot. And I hope everybody will be participating either with Temple Israel, if you are part of my local community, or with whatever community you are in. As we are a Torah study class here at lunchtime, I hope you appreciate the holiday of the giving of the Torah and join in celebration with your communities. The Rabbinical Assembly, which is the Rabbi Association for the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, is doing another live stream event through YouTube. So you can go to their YouTube channel, just look Rabbinical Assembly on YouTube, and you can sign up to watch the live stream presentations for the Tikkun Leil Shavuot, for the night study that will take place next Saturday night. So please avail yourself of that. In addition to the holiday coming up, my vacation is coming up, which means that we will be on hiatus starting next Wednesday. There will be no class until, and I always forget to look this up in advance, there will be no class until July 6th. So that means we're going to have to go 4 weeks without seeing each other and studying together, but please do keep up with your study, as this is a wonderful part of the Torah and that deserves your full attention. So once again, we'll be on break after today until July 6th, and also make sure that you are preparing yourself for the holiday of Shavuot. With that in mind, let's begin the new book. We are in the book of Bamidbar. Bamidbar is, of course, one of the first words of this Torah section, which is where all of the names of the different Torah portions come from, or the Torah books come from. Of course, Bamidbar means literally in the often translated desert. Wilderness is better. Unlike the word desert in English, which has a technical definition related to rainfall, Midbar in Hebrew has a technical definition related to the population. The Midbar is a place that is unpopulated, unsuitable, and uninhabited. It might be called the wastelands, but that's become such a Mad Max term that it doesn't really work in English anymore either. But it's the no man's land, I guess you could also try to render it in English to get closer to the Hebrew feeling. But that's where we are. And like the other names of the different sections of Torah, this too has a bit of a hint about the main topic that is going to be throughout the entire book, which is our journey through the Midbar, the narrative of the people, the events and legislation that happens in our travels. But if you look at the page we're currently looking at, you'll notice that rather than using the Hebrew name, it has the name Numbers. Now, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are the titles that were given to the books of the Torah by the non-Jewish church that was trying to capture in their mind the essence of the books. And you might be able to understand Genesis with creation, and Exodus, of course, with leaving Egypt, Leviticus with the Levitical rules, meaning everything about the priestly class, and Deuteronomy, meaning that second teaching, that does cover the entirety of the book, but Numbers seems a little limited until you start reading the book of Numbers and realize that actually, yeah, Numbers do make up a large proportion of some of the important discussions. They also make up a large proportion of the material that many people start skipping. And I appreciate that. This section of the Torah, with all of the census details, does not speak spiritually, intuitively to many people in the modern world. And we're going to talk about both how to make it more relatable, but also why the author would have included this material and what it would have meant to the people of the original generation and those immediately following this time period. That perhaps, even if it doesn't speak to us, perhaps it did speak to them. Perhaps there is more going on here than a mere spreadsheet, as I've got in my background picture for today. So with that in mind, let's take a little look at some of the spreadsheet. We're not going to read all of the chapters of Numbers, meaning the actual literal numbers this morning, but I do want to get at least a smattering, a sampling of what it looks like. And as we go through, I'm going to be using the Hebrew pronunciation of the names because I find the English pronunciations usually incomprehensible and I always get tongue-tied. So if you'll excuse me every now and then when I pause to flick back my eyes to the Hebrew from the English translation, that's what's going on there. It's trying to make my life easier than figuring out what the Hebrew is supposed to sound like rather than just what the Hebrew says. Okay, we are picking up in chapter 2. This is verse 22, and we are in the midst of the census, the counting of the military-aged men from the different tribes, and they are being counted by tribes, and these are between 20 and 60-year-old people. So let's take up with Benjamin. And the tribe of Benjamin, chieftain of the Benjamites, Avidan ben Gidoni. His troop has enrolled 35,400. The total enrolled in the division of Ephraim, 108,100 for all troops. These shall march third. So this is finishing off the Ephraim contingent. It's hard to come up with good English words for the troop divisions that aren't prejudicial. And now we are going to turn to the next division, which is going to be the northern division. And these are all the arrangements around the Mishkan, the tabernacle, which would have been in the center of the camp. On the north, the standard division of Dan, troop by troop, chieftain of the Danites, Achiezer ben Ammishaddai. His troop, as enrolled, 62,700. Camping next to it, the tribe of Asher, chieftain of the Asherites, Pagiel ben Ochran. His troop, as enrolled, 41,500. And the tribe of Naphtali, chieftain of the Naphtalites, I should have just gone with the Hebrew there too, of the Naphtalites, Achira ben Enan. His troop, as enrolled, 53,400. The total enrolled in the division of Dan, that is to say the northern group that was around the camp, 157,600. These shall march last by their standards, meaning under their flags. So these groups are going to be in the final division of the camp that will join into the column of people marching, and they will be the rear of that column of troops. Everyone with me so far? I know it doesn't exactly sound complicated. I just want to make sure that no one's getting lost by the numbers. And you can find wonderful pictures online that show the camp arrayed with different numbers around each of them. I don't want to get down into the weeds, but if you're that interested to see how the census looks graphically around the camp and how the marching would have looked if you were physically there, by all means, go ahead and check that out. Those are the enrollments of the Israelites by ancestral houses. The total enrolled in the divisions for all troops, 603,550. The Levites, however, were not recorded among the Israelites as Adonai had commanded Moses. And then we're going to find out more about the Levites in later chapters and their counts, their divisions, their jobs. But the Levites had special jobs. They were not part of the general army. All right, so there is our number, 603,550 men of fighting age that were taken as part of the census here as we are preparing to leave Mount Sinai finally after the building of the Mishkan and the giving of the Torah up to this point. And we needed to know the number of troops because, of course, we are about to go marching into the land of Israel. And if you're going marching into the land of Israel, you need to know how many soldiers you have in order to be able to handle these things. Now, you might be scratching your head. I certainly hope you are, for a number of different reasons. The first reason you might be scratching your head is 603,550 soldiers requires a lot of non-combatants. That is to say, if these are the people between 20 and 60, what about those older? What about those younger? And what about the women? Where do they figure into this, and how many would they have been? We're looking at probably, by most conservative estimates, of a total population of Israelites, if 603,550 is our number, we are looking at probably 2 million people, which seems to be a practical impossibility. But the other thing that might have you scratching your head is the fact that this number seems awfully familiar if you've read the Torah before. So we're going to jump into our commentary here, and you'll find that the counting that we see in Numbers 1, as well as a way that it's repeated in Numbers 10, as well as the actual count that comes near the end of the book of Numbers in chapter 26, all come back to this same 603,550. And this seems odd for a number of reasons. Of how is it that the population didn't change? I mean, after all, if you have 603,550 people, not even counting anyone else, well, people are growing up and people are dying. The population fluctuates daily. So the census between one day and the next day should be different, let alone between 1 year and 40 years later. That seems to be very problematic. So let's take a look at some of the ways we might understand the immutability of these numbers, and hopefully that will help us not only get through the issues of the census itself, sometimes The joy of the internet. Sorry for everyone. Hopefully you can hear me again. And hopefully we didn't lose too much time. All right, so let's go ahead and resume. I'll try and pick up where I think I left off. Well, you know, if some of it got a little bit lost, that's okay. So we'll hopefully get our tool set in order by looking at boy, it is determined to be frustrating today. Let's try that again. All right, so there's two different ways to read Ibn Ezra. Hopefully we got that far. One is to read him very simplistically, simple, and saying that he is saying, wow, what a miracle that in 20 days there was no death, and by implication also nobody getting old enough to be qualified for the count. The other way to read it is, as often happens by many of our commentators, that when they say something is a great wonder, they mean this is something that we should investigate. This is something we should ask more about. That it's not enough to simply note that it happened and say, wow, although that's a great start to at least note something as being unusual, but that unusual things require more study. So let's take a look at Rashi. See if I can get Rashi all on the page. Yes. We cannot say that this census, here he is talking about the census back in Exodus, is the one described in Bamidbar, the census that we're talking about, for we are told there in Bamidbar on the first day of the second month, back in chapter 1, while the Mishkan was established on the first day of the first month, meaning the month of Nisan. And from this counting, the one that's in Shemot, the sockets were made from shekalim alone, from those that were donated. In other words, there were two countings, one at the beginning of their contributions after Yom Kippur in the first year, and the other in the second year in Iyar, when the Mishkan was established. Very well and good. Separating those two countings helps part of the narrative confusion that sometimes happens. But if you say, is it possible that in both censuses, Israel numbered the same 603,550? Those two censuses took place in 2 different years. It is impossible that there were not 19-year-olds who were not counted in the first census who would have been 20 by the time of the second. Maybe we could understand between the two numbers within the book of Bamidbar itself, only 20 days apart, maybe no one had a birthday. It's impossible with that large population, but maybe we could imagine that. But between 2 different years, by definition, people were growing up. Some people were also aging out. How do we answer that? The answer is that in terms of the ages of the people, both censuses were conducted in the same year. His solution is, but in the term of the time elapsed since the exodus from Egypt, the censuses took place in 2 different years, because the exodus from Egypt is counted from Nisan, as we learned in Masechet Rosh Hashanah in the forum, and the Mishkan was built in the first year and established in the second, for a new year started on the 1st of Nisan. But people's ages are counted according to the years of the world, starting in Tishrei. Thus, both censuses took place in the same year. The first was in Tishrei after Yom Kippur, when the Holy One was appeased and forgave them and commanded them to build the Mishkan. The second took place on the 1st of Iyar. So, if you got lost in the calendar, don't worry, I'm going to try and explain it. Hopefully you'll be less confused, at least I hope. So what Rashi is saying is that when you number the number of years since we left Egypt, that we always go according to the Exodus from Egypt, which means the month of Nisan. And after you reach one full anniversary of the month of Nisan, you add another year each time that happens. But for the ages of people, Rashi is arguing that people are aged, that is to say, they get another one added to their year total based upon the Rosh Hashanah calendar. So in Tishrei, they go up one. And what he is arguing here is that since there is an overlap between the month that would have been from Tishrei to Tishrei, and the year from Tishrei to Tishrei, and the year from Nisan to Nisan, that indeed the census for 1 year would have been the same as the next year, because with regards to aging, the year hadn't gone past. Now, that sounds a little weird that we would be keeping track of ages based upon the month of Rosh Hashanah. There's a couple things to think about. One is that in many communities, it was true that people did not keep track of birthdays the way we now do. That when a child was born, you might remember the season they were born in, but you might not remember the actual date, simply because infant mortality was so high, and thus people did not commemorate that first day alive, because the first day alive was the first day of basically danger, continuing danger, and you would wait at least 30 days before you really began to feel confident that this child had a chance to keep going. And even then, childhood illnesses, most of which have now been eradicated by good hygiene and vaccines, would still take a huge toll on so many. And so you might not remember the precise day of the calendar when they were born. Easier to keep track of them just by saying what year from Rosh Hashanah were they born in. Was it the year like now, 5,782? Is it last year, 5,781? And yes, that'll mean somebody that was born the day before Rosh Hashanah and somebody that was born the day after Rosh Hashanah are going to have 1 year difference added to their name during that time period. That's okay. That is a way of keeping track of names, keeping track of ages. However, you might still be skeptical and say, but Rabbi, come on, couldn't we have a little more precision than that when we're doing a census, for crying out loud? Well, yes, but when we look at our school census, like for our religious school or in a secular school as well, we count people based upon grades. Now, a grade is not based upon your birthday. It doesn't matter whether you were born in April or whether you were born in January, you're going to be in the same grade. And that grade will move as a lump. And all 7th graders are 7th graders, even though there could be 10 months difference in the ages between the oldest and youngest in some of the different grades. So we do still have an idea of lumping people together based upon a year. It's a school year rather than a calendar year, or rather than any other type of year, but we do still lump people together. So it's not totally weird to imagine that kind of grouping. However, this explanation, while it does definitely help the math work, still seems a little unsatisfying, because it does involve a little bit of suspension of disbelief that even still, nobody happened to change at all. Nobody died, for example. I mean, I get that maybe we're not counting 19-year-olds that became 20 or 60-year-olds that became 61, but what about the guy that got bit by a snake? What about somebody whose horse kicked him in the head? They don't follow the countings of years. They would be dead. And if we're counting a second time within that same year, no matter how you want to count that year, they wouldn't show up the second time. So that's still a little unsatisfying. And so we're going to try one more option, which is from Ramban, from Nachmanides, which I don't think I'm going to get on one page, so bear with me when I scroll. Oh, sorry, no, we're not. I was going to bring Nachmanides, that's right. Never mind, for the sake of time, which now that we've lost so much because of our internet problems, it's probably a good thing. Instead, I'm going to bring you from a wonderful book, modern book called Ani Ma'amin, I Believe. It's the introduction to a version of Rambam's 13 Principles of Faith. It's saying, I believe with perfect faith. And his is an attempt in this book for us to understand the texts of the Tanakh as they were intended, not as sometimes they have been distorted in the modern frame. So he has an entire section near the beginning of the book talking about the purpose of how the Tanakh was written, and in particular, the numbers of Tanakh. So let us see his approach. The books of the Tanakh were written and read along the lines of exhortation. That is to say, they were there to inspire, to instruct, not merely to inform. And that's important, that it was both written for that purpose and that it was understood by the audience that that was how they should be reading it. And these are works in which a degree of embroidery and rhetorical embellishment is layered upon a base of fact. We're going to come back to that issue if you're having trouble with that statement. The primary interest of all books of the Tanakh is to bring Israel to greater covenantal piety in its relationship with the Almighty. That's the purpose of Tanakh. The Tanakh assumes that readers and listeners approach the biblical text in submission with a desire to learn its lessons. And people are coming to learn the lesson of the Tanakh in order that they can be closer in their relationship to God. The Tanakh also assumes that readers leave it to the divinely inspired authors of the texts to determine the most effective way to cast the events of the past in order to transmit its lessons. This can be very threatening for some on religious grounds, because it suggests that some aspects of the biblical accounts are not fully factual, but rather rhetorical. But this is threatening only if we allow ourselves to fall into the trap of buying into what our modern environment tells us. The environment we live in tells us that the more factual an account is, the truer it is, and hence the more valuable it is. By contrast, the Tanakh, and indeed the entire rabbinic tradition, and there he's including Midrash, Mishnah, and Talmud, proceeds on different assumptions. The Tanakh is a valuable account of the past, not because all its records is fact, all it records is fact. It is a valuable account of the past because of the divine authority behind it. It is valuable because it casts the events of the past in a way that ensures that we come away with the most important messages those events have to teach. All right, so this is, I personally find one of my my newest favorite quotes by a Jewish author of putting succinctly an approach that is necessary to truly connect to the Tanakh. You shouldn't read the Tanakh as though you were reading a book on the biography of Abraham Lincoln, where, yes, if you read a biography of Abraham Lincoln and there are authorial embellishments about his past, you would be rightly angry to say this is not what actually happened in Abraham Lincoln's life. Perfectly fine, because the author is in a context of writing for informational purposes, and thus any deviation from the facts that are available to us would be a betrayal of his goal and of the trust the reader puts into him. But if I am writing a book written that is considered to be part of our religious core, not just any old person, but an actual religious core that's about Abraham's life, then I must understand that the purpose of that book was not just to give me the biographical details of a guy named Abraham. The Bible was not created purely so we would have material for an encyclopedia entry. The Bible was created so we would be guided and inspired by the events as they were described. And thus, as they were described, becomes a feature of its narrative in addition to the facts upon which those descriptions are based, which means any savvy reader will understand that what may appear to be a boring account is in fact a rhetorical flourish, is in fact an attempt to inspire the reader. Now, yes, as Rabbi Berman does in more of his book, and I do not have all of the quotes, obviously, because go buy his book, what he explains is that as modern readers, we have been trained to read books differently than the original audience of the Tanakh. The original audience of the Tanakh would have understood this implicitly and explicitly, and asking constantly, did that really happen? Were there really X number of people standing there? Wait, how did they actually have enough food for that many people? How much water? How many clothes? How big would the camp have been? How many days would it have taken to walk across? That those are great questions to ask about the biography of Abraham Lincoln, but they are missing the point of why God chose for the Tanakh to even be written and transmitted to us to this day. That it was chosen to be written and transmitted so that we would have an understanding of God, not to be able to create a picture-perfect recreation of the events that are contained within. That we would understand the truth of the meaning of the events more than just what a video camera might have captured. Now, if you want more proof for that, you're like me. And that means we're going to jump to one of his examples dealing with a different set of numbers, very similar to the numbers that we've been dealing with. Numbers in the Tanakh, meaning in general. Well, throughout the writings of the ancient Near East, we find that numbers are often unrealistically large, especially when reported in a military context, such as army size or the detail of booty taken from an enemy. And indeed, in the book of Numbers, we are dealing with army size. In the Tanakh as well, numbers may be used to reflect something other than what we should define as a quantitative reality, meaning that if you were standing there as an objective observer counting along with the situation, you'd probably come to a different number. Now, note the fact that this is a common literary style throughout the ancient Near East is very important, because it means that the common reader throughout the ancient Near East, of which we were members, would have understood this convention when reading it in the text or having it be transmitted to them orally, that this fits the audience that it was first received it. So let's look at the example he gives. The armies of Judah in the book of Chronicles. Right? In the second book of Chronicles, we find troop figures for the armies of many of the kings of Judah. Concerning the first 4 of these kings, these figures are listed over 6 chapters. The army of Rehoboam, we are told, numbered 180,000. The army of his son, Abijah, numbered 400,000. The army of Asa was comprised of 2 units. One numbered 300,000 and the other numbered 280,000. Finally, the armies of Jehoshaphat, his son, consisted of 5 units. Those units numbered 300,000, 280,000, 200,000, 200,000, and 180,000 men. These numbers are all quite large and cannot conform to any realistic picture of what we know about life in the land of Israel at the time. In fact, the armies of Jehoshaphat totaled over 1 million soldiers, and that is simply physically impossible. There is no way that there were 1 million men under arms during that time. When we look at these numbers a little more closely, though, we see 2 trends. One is that some of the numbers are what we would term large round numbers, 200, 300, 400,000. The other numbers we might term semi-rounded figures, 180,000, 280,000, each of which appears twice. Put differently, the figures that are semi-rounded, of which there are 4, all end with 80,000. That seems a bit odd. After all, if the armies are presented as rounded to the nearest 10,000, one would not expect that all 4 examples of armies that are not rounded to the nearest 100,000 all happen to round to 80,000. Meaning if we're rounding them to 10,000s, which is how you would get to 180 or 280, then what are the odds that the only armies that are not perfectly lining up on the 100,000 mark happen to line up on the 80,000 mark? For all these reasons, it is difficult to read these figures as reflective of quantitative realities. These are not actual counts of actual people. One perceptive scholar has recently discerned a clear pattern that points to the meaning inherent in these numbers. The sum of Jehoshaphat's armies total 1,160,000. This figure is exactly double the size of his father Asa's armies. The figure is also exactly equivalent to the sum of all the armies of the 3 kings of Judah who preceded him, recorded above. The narrative of 2 Chronicles casts Jehoshaphat as the most righteous of the kings of Judah, more so than any of his predecessors or those that immediately followed him. The author of Chronicles uses the troop numbers to convey the idea in keeping with an ancient convention of employing non-realistic numbers. As a reward for his righteousness, Jehoshaphat commanded not only the largest army, but rhetorically speaking, an army so large that it doubled the size of his father's armies and equaled the total of all of those who preceded him. Put differently, the Book of Chronicles depicts troop numbers not to convey reality, but to convey meaning. There are many other numerical figures in the Book of Chronicles that do not seem realistic and which we cannot as of yet explain in symbolic terms. However, the observation that Jehoshaphat's armies equaled the total of his predecessors surely cannot be coincidental. It represents a literary use of numbers in a way that is not intuitive for us today. So just as a summary, because I got to try to get his words out before I put too much of my own spin on them, what he is trying to point out is that if you do the math on these numbers, if you're actually going to take them seriously as numbers, that a very obvious and striking pattern emerges, that Jehoshaphat, who happened to be the righteous king of that period of our history, has an army that is double his father, who was very far from being righteous, and that is more than all of the preceding kings that were in the generations in front of him. This is implying, of course, that he was greater than them. And as a literary device that would be understood by the people of the ancient world when they heard it, having a number that was double his father is obviously trying to say, this is a person greater than his father. By using something that was greater than all of the preceding kings, we are clearly indicating the favor of the narrator being shown to this particular king. Also, it is using a narrative technique that would have been readily understood by every listener, even those perhaps who were not yet fully engaged or embracing the concept of measuring worth by righteousness. Sure, we might think that listing the measure of somebody's army has no bearing on whether they were a righteous person or not, because we have lived through the horrible wars of the 20th century, and we know that there are plenty of countries with huge armies that are completely despotic and unrighteous. However, in the ancient world, this was, as we saw at the beginning of Rabbi Berman's discussion, the common literary description for the greatness of a king, the size of their army. And thus, to speak to an uneducated or perhaps ambivalent audience that is wavering in their support of God or respecting the idea of righteousness, to use a technique they would recognize as saying this guy was great and powerful would be a very compelling technique indeed. It is using the medium of its day, it's using the idiom of its day in order to get a message across to an ambivalent or insecure audience that needs to hear things in the terminology that will resonate with them where they currently stand. Having been drawn into Torah, of course, they will recognize that there are more important measures of a king's greatness than just the size of their army, but they have to be drawn into the idea first. And using literary techniques that would have been universally understood allows for the message to be spread universally, rather than only to those that are already in the system, if you will, that have already bought into those techniques. All right, now before we jump back to our discussion of the census, are there any questions or comments that people would like to share? Okay, so let's talk about our census. And we'll just scroll back up so we have something to look at, because we live in an era where visual things are very compelling to everyone. How do we understand the census that's going on here, the 603,550? Like I mentioned, there are two problems with that. One is it's too many people. And two, it's too perfect a number in the sense that it repeats in multiple times, both with the half shekel and then the first counting of Bamidbar, the 20 days later, and then the final counting before we're dividing the land. It seems improbable that we would always come up to that same number. Indeed, it would seem negative that we would always come up with that same number, because if it always comes up on the same number, does that mean after 40 years, the population has gone nowhere? That there has been no growth, no life, no forward progress in the expansion of the nation? Well, when we see this now as an archetypal number of trying to say that there was a consistency within the community, that there was a perfection within the community, that the people who were at the beginning are equivalent to the people who came at the end, then we are making a statement about the preparedness. After all, we know that a huge number of people are going to die in the wilderness. The people who refuse to go up, those that were over the age of 20, indeed our actual count from the first count, are going to perish before we go in 40 years, well, 38 years later, technically. And we would be worried that the community would be diminished by their loss over that period. No, says the census, it comes to be the same number. It comes out to be the same great equivalent at the end. Indeed, the nation is just as strong. We were not weakened by having been chastised. We were not weakened by having been delayed. And we are not going to succeed where they failed because we have more than they did. If we had gone to a higher number, then you might have said, well, the generation at the end of 40 years, they only had the bravery to go into Israel and follow God because they had double or triple the number of soldiers as the original generation. By keeping it identical, you are saying they were in the same place as their parents were, and they responded better. They responded differently. This is a new generation. That entire understanding would be lost if the number was not identical. Either they would have been diminished, which would have meant that we had suffered needlessly, or they would have had an increase, which meant that their bravery would have been discounted as a pure calculation of arms. Having it be the same number shows a consistency of situation with a different outcome because we chose better that second time. It's absolutely essential with that in mind that the numbers come out to be the same. And as for the numbers being too large, well, how else do you describe the greatness of a people except by a hyperinflated number? This is the trope, as Rabbi Berman explained, from the ancient Near East. This is how you describe greatness in that time period. And so, of course, we're going to get an unrealistic number, because to do anything realistic would have been insulting. People who were used to the hyperinflated numbers would have looked at the honest numbers, however many tens of thousands there might have been, and said, "Pah, what a pathetic bit of rabble. These are no one." And as I've discussed in other classes, we know from the book of Deuteronomy that God himself points out that we are the smallest of people and that we are not large in size. So clearly this number, which would have been earth-shaking at that time, cannot be a literal number. Instead, it is a measure of what the greatness we should feel. It is a measure of how God's faith in us should inspire us to feel this greatness, regardless of the physical count, the quantitative reality, as Rabbi Berman put it, of the people around us. And so too in the modern world, when people have an obsession with counting the Jewish population, constantly trying to see, is it growing, is it shrinking, assimilation, low birth rate, all of these types of questions. I think, yes, it's healthy to keep track of the demographics of your community to be able to serve them and meet the needs and plan for the future. But also, this is not the measure of our greatness. This is not the place where we should be fixated with all of our energy. Instead, we should be fixated on exactly the purpose of the Tanakh, redoubling our efforts to deepen the connection between ourselves and God, and allowing that to enrich our lives and to enrich our communities. And however many people are involved in that, that is wonderful, beautiful, but we do not need to obsess constantly over the bean counting of people, but instead focused on the greatness of the Spirit and putting that into our practice. Any questions or comments?
I have a question. Thinking about the census, is it right to think of this as a ritual? A one-time ritual like the Passover lamb was a one-time ritual that everybody participated in. And so if we see this in terms of this being a ritual, 603,000 represents everybody, every adult in the community. And I'm thinking about what are the children supposed to be witnessing? What are the children supposed to be learning by witnessing this quasi-ritual in which every adult participates?
So the census itself is not ritualistic. And in fact, it is severely frowned upon to do censuses without proper authorization from God. This is something that King David gets into a lot of trouble for. The half shekel, on the other hand, which functions like a census, that is a ritual that would happen every year, that every member of the community would bring that half shekel. And of course, if you add up the shekels and divide by 2, you know how many people there are. And that was an annual event. And of course, what would people be learning from that would be our shared and equal responsibility for the community. And in particular, yes, children would see that everybody is equal in their importance to God. Everybody equally supports the community, although certainly people were always free to give more voluntary donations in other ways, but that the foundation was built upon that equality and built upon that universality was an absolutely essential lesson, and one that I think sometimes people too easily forget in our modern world. All right, so we're going to go ahead and wrap it up there. I'm glad the internet let me finish at least. A reminder that Shavuot is coming up. Go and be part of the giving of the Torah one more time. And also my own holiday, my vacation is coming up. And so from next week, I'll be off, and our next class will be on July 7th. Take care, everyone, and see you in a while.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a wonderful vacation.